So aside from not being able to move around, another problem that a lot of these Native Americans are having is keeping up the supply of buffalo. A lot of white settlers have been killing buffalo and not necessarily using them completely in the way that the Native Americans would, and it's really depleting their food supply. Especially because buffalo provided so much more than food. They really used every single part of the buffalo. So not having that is really negatively affecting a lot of different Native American tribes. Disease is also spreading from a lot of white settlers to the Native Americans if they haven't been exposed to it before. It's causing a lot of Native Americans to continue to get sick and start to die out. And people pretty much had forgotten that there were even Native Americans out west. Like, we just haven't been talking about them, and they hadn't been relevant to what's been happening in the East in so long that when people start moving to the West, they really weren't considering what was happening to the Native Americans at all, and like how the way that the Native Americans were living and their environment might be damaged by what all of this incoming settlement from white people from the East. So it's just going to continue. So in 1864, we have one of our worst ever treatments of Native Americans. It's known as the Sand Creek Massacre. So this was a Colorado militia that was led by this guy, John Shivington, and he had come up upon some Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians who were out in that area. And the Native Americans tried to signal that they were like friendly with Americans by holding up the American flag, but John Shivington ordered that his militia fire anyway, and they killed pretty much everyone, like men, women, children. It was just really, really horrible. So when word got out about what happened at Sand Creek, obviously people were absolutely livid and just really disgusted by the treatment, and the Native Americans were feeling just even more neglected and attacked by the U.S. government, not even just settlers, but by the government itself. So a lot of the Plains Indians start coming together to oppose the militia in those areas. And after all of this, after this war, the troops who had been sent west were told that they could keep anything that they had stolen from the Native Americans. They could just like have whatever they wanted. So to sort of try to keep up supply. So that gave the Indians, I mean, not the Indians, but the white soldiers even more of a reason to attack the Native Americans who they had been fighting with. So things just got worse when the federal government announced that they were going to start building railroads through the Indian land in the north to try to build the Transcontinental Railroad faster. So they really were needing to build through a lot of Indian reservations. So a Native American tribe leader named Red Cloud, he lured Captain William Fetterman, who was a militia leader, into an ambush in that area and killed all of the soldiers. So the United States at that point, the government was feeling like not only are we trying to build this railroad, but now we sort of almost have an excuse to take the land away from these people because we can just sort of like make them out to be like violent savages like they had been doing before. So the United States Indian Peace Commission decided that peace would only happen if all of the Native Americans just abandoned their own previous culture and assimilated into American culture. We've talked about assimilation before with the immigrants coming from Europe. Well, we basically want the Native Americans to start doing the same thing. So in 1868, we pretty much forced the Native Americans to sign the Fort Laramie Treaty. And that's a photograph there is what's happening, is the signing of the Fort Laramie Treaty. And in that treaty, we basically agreed not to build through the Sioux territory. And then in exchange, they're going to assimilate or something. They said that we would open up Western land for Indian assimilation, but a lot of the money that we put into doing that is going to be mismanaged by corrupt leaders. And the government doesn't really care what happens to it because they don't really care about Native Americans. So, we don't really take care of the natives in that area like we're meant to. So this sort of leads us into the Red River War. The Red River War was a series of, big battles and small battles, and then just sort of like fights, not even something that you would flat out call a battle. So it really starts because more and more promises to these Native Americans are being broken, like providing them land and saying that we're not going to build through their reservation when we try to anyway. and the white settlers are continuously moving in and stealing their land in Buffalo. So the natives attack a bunch of Texans near the Red River in 1874, and this basically goes on for a year, the Red River War between white settlers and militia and the Native Americans. And then finally the Native Americans surrender, like I said, about a year later in 1875. So gold is going to continue to lead settlers into these areas that had been reserved and protected for Sioux Indians. And so basically we would, set land aside in the West for Native Americans, and then we would find out that it had natural resources, whether it be gold or oil or timber or whatever we wanted, and then we would basically just start breaking our promises and taking it back from them. So there were 2 Sioux leaders who were working to prevent all of this from happening, and their names are Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. You've probably heard of one, if not both of these 2 guys. So Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull start working to drive all of the white settlers out. So the United States sent General George Custer in to deal with it. And these 2 groups, they meet at the Little Bighorn River, which is in Montana. And the soldiers were significantly outnumbered by the Native Americans. There were about 2,000 Native Americans at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and only about 250 white soldiers with General Custer. So obviously General George Custer and all of his men were killed by the Native Americans. So eventually, when the U.S. comes back, when we send more troops back for revenge, Sitting Bull was like, no, I'm not trying to get involved in this. I know that they're just going to keep sending more and more men until they kill us, so I'm going to leave. So Sitting Bull and his men flee to Canada out of the reach of the U.S. government, leaving Crazy Horse there, who it just sort of refuses to leave at all, and him and his men fight the next troops, but eventually they're forced to surrender as well. So the government has captured Crazy Horse, but Sitting Bull is still out there, and the government's like, you know what, whatever, we'll just let him go. He's in Canada. If he's not here, he's not causing problems. We don't need to worry about him. But that only lasts for a little while. So a movement after that started to sweep across all sorts of different Native American tribes called the Ghost Dance Movement. And it was basically this dance that you could do to summon the power of your ancestors, and they would use that power to drive out white settlers. And this really worried the government, not because they believed it, not because they were like, oh my gosh, these Native Americans are going to do a dance and summon like millions of dead Native Americans to fight us. They did not believe that that was going to happen, but they were worried that this would unite a lot of different Native American tribes, because like I said, this was across all different tribes. This wasn't just one. This wasn't like just the Sioux were getting involved in the Ghost Dance movement. All sorts of different tribes were participating in this, and they didn't want anything to connect all of the Native Americans, because they knew that if they all were banded together, then they would be a lot more difficult to fight. So in 1890, in an effort to sort of like cut them off at the knees, they ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull. And I remember he has gone to Canada at that point, and they were going to let him go. But in 1890, to try to like sort of remind everyone what kind of power the federal government has, they order his arrest. So he ends up somehow coming back to the United States. I don't know why he would when there's a warrant out for his arrest, but he does, and that's where they sort of meet up with him at the Battle of Wounded Knee, and he and a bunch of others were killed, and then the people who had gotten away ran away, but they chased after the stragglers and killed them as well. So finally the federal government has managed to squash out the resistance from Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. So that just leads us into assimilation. Now that we're really cracking down on that Native American resistance, they start pushing assimilation as the only answer. So people hoped that as the buffalo died out, that the Native Americans would have no choice but to assimilate into white culture. And something that even happens is the U.S. government even starts ordering soldiers to kill giant herds of buffalo to like actively try and deplete the Native Americans' food supply, to try to force them out. So if you ever see photographs of, like a mountain, there's a really famous photograph of like a mountain of bison skulls. Those were all killed by soldiers who had been told to do that to try to deplete their food supply. So a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson and a bunch of other authors, but she wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor about sort of how the Native Americans had been treated in the United States for the past 100 years, and a bunch of other authors. They really spoke out against the forced assimilation of Native Americans. So this wasn't something that necessarily all white people were down for. This is just something that the government was pushing. So in 1871, the government passed a law saying that they would no longer recognize the sovereignty or the power of tribes. So essentially saying that we see all Native Americans as the same, and if the Cherokee, if they want to talk to us, whatever we decide with the Cherokee is going to affect everyone. We're not making individual agreements with all of these different Native American tribes. They're all the same to us, regardless of the fact that they all practice different religions, have different customs, speak different languages. We're basically going to treat them all the same at this point. And things got worse in 1887 when we passed the Dawes Act. You see Dawes written right there on that giant guy's forehead as he's eating the land. So it's also called the Dawes General Allotment Act or the Dawes Severalty Act. So basically what the Dawes Act did is it ends the reservation system. It basically says no more Indian reservations, and instead each Indian family is going to get 160 acres of land for farming. And in the East, that amount of land would have been totally fine. Like if you gave someone 160 acres in North Carolina, that's rad. Like that's a lot of land, and you can do a lot of stuff on that. But in the West, that's not as good because the ground isn't as fertile as it is in the East. So 160 acres isn't really going to give you the kind of crop yield you would get in North Carolina, Georgia, or any of the other eastern states. So they said that the land that they were giving them couldn't be sold or transferred for 25 years. So we're giving all these families this land, and we're essentially forcing them to use it and build a home on it and start like getting involved in agriculture, and which is essentially forcing them to assimilate into white culture because we're not allowing them to sell that and take the money and do something else with it. Or they can't even sort of like combine it and create it all under one reservation. So they hoped that doing all of this would essentially force the younger generations to just embrace it. All of these children they were hoping would grow up in a culture of assimilation, and then just sort of like as time goes on and generations continue to be born and brought up in the system, that eventually the old Native American customs and things like that would just die out. They even create a bunch of boarding schools to help the assimilation process. So they would bring Native American children to these schools where they would have their hair cut in the style of like white people in the East, and they would be forced to dress like white people, and they weren't allowed to speak their native languages, and some of them were even given new names that were not native names and things like that. So basically sort of like stripping children of their heritage, which is a really traumatizing and horrible thing. And this just sort of sends the message that things are really not going to get better. This is just where things are continuously getting worse as time goes on, and the relationship between the government and the Native Americans isn't going to get better for a very long time.